Good evening. My name is Norman Conti, and I'm the coordinator of the Social Justice Association at Duquesne University and a member of the Elsinore Bennu Think Tank for Restorative Justice. A group that 6 men serving life sentences at SCI Pittsburgh and I founded together. In only a short time, that group grew to include other faculty, students, artists, and activists. Our initial goal was to develop a version of the Inside Out Prison Exchange program that would allow police officers and recruits to come into prison and learn alongside incarcerated citizens. Beyond our success with that program, the EBTT also hosted a number of events at SCI Pittsburgh and published the book Life Sentences, Writings from Inside of an American Prison. After the closure of SCI Pittsburgh, the think tank moved to campus at Duquesne, where a committed group of returning citizens, students, and faculty from a number of other local universities grew it into so much more than its founders ever imagined. The founding members who could not be with us tonight are Fly, Malachi, Sean, and Oscar, as well as Brother Khalifa, whose spirit is always with us. In happier news, Farouk could be with us, but it's his girlfriend's birthday, so he took the night off. Tonight, we're here to screen and discuss the second episode of Philly D.A. This program is a truly exceptional 8-episode docuseries following the first term of District Attorney Larry Krasner. This event tonight is dedicated to using the second episode as a catalyst for reimagining justice in our democracy, as well as taking the concrete steps necessary for bringing those ideas into reality. We want to emphasize that this series is an important teaching tool which is available to schools for future events like this one, and we truly hope to see the next episode hosted by someone in tonight's audience. We're going to watch this episode together and then have a live panel discussion with Ted Passon, one of the filmmakers, District Attorney Larry Krasner himself, as well as members and friends of the Elsinore Bennu Think Tank for Restorative Justice. Ted Passon. Ted is an award-winning filmmaker and video artist who co-created and produced Philly D.A. along with Yanni Brooke and Nicole Salazar. Ted, the work your team has done in producing this record of Mr. Krasner and his team's effort is a gift to everyone interested in justice, and it is a sincere honor to have you with us tonight. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. Yeah, I'm excited for everybody to watch episode 2. It's a little bit of a coming home for me to do stuff with the Inside Out family. I was a member of the Inside Out program in 2002, and it was an incredible experience and one that I will never forget. Certainly helped influence me along my path to make Philly D.A. I came from a family that was not unfamiliar with having people locked up, but there was still something about that. Doesn't necessarily mean you're sitting together and you're thinking about the criminal justice system in any kind of nuanced way. So, to have that experience of, being on the inside, being with folks who are incarcerated, being with other students, having those conversations was just completely an incredibly formative experience. And so, yeah, I'm just excited to be back with this crew and to have everybody watch the series. So I guess just to set everybody up for what you're going to see tonight. So Philly D.A. in its entirety is an 8-part series. So what we're going to be screening tonight is episode 2 of that series. And previously, I'll do a little last time on Philly D.A. Basically what happened is Larry Krasner is a former civil rights attorney, spent 30 years representing groups like Black Lives Matter, ACT UP, Occupy, you name it, spent his entire career in opposition to the DA's office, decided that he was going to throw his hat into the ring to run for the position of district attorney, which was considered ridiculous. I mean, I remember hearing about it myself at the time and I laughed. I never, even starting this project, we never thought he was going to win. But he shocked us and the city and the rest of the country by actually winning. And so when he took over the position of district attorney, some big things happened. One, he let go about 10% of the attorneys in the office, which is not actually that atypical when a district attorney comes in. However, it hadn't happened in recent history in Philadelphia because the DA had not, the previous DA, the two DAs before had been in for about 20 years, and the DA just prior to him really just kind of kept a lot of people in place, didn't change much. And so so that shakeup happened. And so there are some people left who are from, say, maybe more traditional way of thinking in the DA's office. And so you're going to meet people in that, who are kind of leftover from that guard. And then also at the end of the episode, as he and his team are going through files of people who had been let go from the office, they discover a file folder that's literally labeled damaged goods that is full of secret files of police misconduct. And what they determined pretty quickly was that these were files that were never handed over to defense attorneys, which flies in the face of the constitutional obligation of the prosecutor. And so when you pick up with them in this episode, they're going to be kind of figuring out what to do with those files and seeing what else they have, and then figuring out how they're going to handle police misconduct, tracking police misconduct, and disclosing it to the defense. Because even if you have a will to disclose it to the defense, it's still a complicated measure to actually get all the appropriate information and to give it to them. And as you'll see, it becomes a little bit harder for the Krasner administration than it would have been for previous administrations. Yeah, but I hope people enjoy the episode, and I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards.
Hi, Ted, we can't hear the sound.
I'm sorry, the sound isn't coming through. Let's try it again. Sorry, 1 second.
There's a button on the bottom left-hand side when you screen share that says share sound, and you have to make sure that's checked. That could be one of
It is checked. It was making me install a new updated version of Zoom, as of course always happens when you're under the gun like this. Let me see if that just worked.
Previously on Philly.
Voters in Philadelphia have chosen a progressive as their new district attorney.
Krasner campaign themes have made him a hero to some and a bum to others.
I think it'd be a disaster.
Dozens of people employed by the district attorney's office shown the door today.
I'm one of the few survivors. Almost everybody's gone. So that's kind of sad. This experiment has to succeed.
Anybody who's dealt with this office knows that there are secrets. We need to find out where the secrets are.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's showtime!
New tonight, the DA's office keeps a do not call list about police accused of wrongdoing.
A list of officers so troubled, prosecutors will not call them to testify. Corruption, child sex abuse, drunk driving, assault, domestic abuse, drug dealing, mishandling evidence, lying to authorities.
Police take an oath. You give them a gun and a badge and arrest power. You expect that, the least they can do is tell the truth and be honest, be trustworthy. There are police officers on that do not call list who are so untrustworthy that they can't even be called to testify.
Any officer whose ability to testify credibly is compromised is of great concern to us, even prior to the list. The last thing we want is an injustice in any direction, but these are things that are unfolding right now, so it's something I really can't speak with any kind of finality to.
A half-century ago, the Supreme Court ruled that prosecutors are required to disclose information that may hurt their own cases because it's in the interest of justice. That means prosecutors must tell the defense if key witnesses, including police officers, have a record of dishonesty.
I've been here 10 years already, so finding that list was a bit of a shock. It doesn't even feel real. I wouldn't think that anyone would bury information like that.
To me, the story is how the prior administration wasn't disclosing the misconduct to the defense when defendants were being accused of crimes. A police officer made false reports in a police report, and they say don't disclose. That's incomprehensible to me.
The truth is, this office, before we came in, was basically a cover-up organization. I have seen an email in a prior administration from the first assistant to another high-level supervisor about how we know that there are these problematic officers involved in these cases. Let's hurry up and try to get guilty pleas without telling defense counsel about the problems. You're actually talking about an office dedicated to violating the Constitution, and we are not that.
This list of corrupt police officers, those who have been under investigation or found guilty for misconduct. There's about 24 names on it, which actually from the black community, we find hard to believe that there's only 24 cops that are under investigation. The point is that we need that list to facilitate the release of all of those who have been convicted and imprisoned as a result of prosecutorial misconduct.
Let's understand, I didn't write that list. That list was written by a prior administration. A lot of that list will be coming out very likely next week, certainly within about 10 days.
So looking at the list, there are a lot of bad things here. But in terms of making sure that a trial is fair, the most important things have to do with lying, stealing, being an unreliable witness. So what we have to do is we have to see what is this short list that the old guard left behind before we build something real.
Hey, I'm sorry to make you late.
All right, let's talk.
What I want you to do is go through the list and tell me who you think we are going to say is a do not call. Lying is never call. The other ones, it just kind of depends. It's going to be more of a case-by-case basis, is what I think.
It's just that they're also arguably being deceptive about what they did. I mean, nobody writes up police paperwork to say, and then I lost my cool and busted his nose. It's always, then he fell and... What do you do when an officer's charged with burglary? Improper sexual touching by a supervisor.
The past administration, there was like a ton of shit on some of these cops, but they only selectively included a little bit of information. So as we go back and look at the records, and if there's 9 other reasons why you might want to say do not call, I'll show it to you.
Okay. Aids and abets a prostitution escort business. Lying during a departmental investigation. Oh my goodness. What he was fighting at a wedding reception. It's Philly.
Officer, do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth?
I do.
You have a seat. With every new police academy class, the DA's office is invited to come assist with their courtroom training. We go through mock hearing exercises. The goal is to make police officers more comfortable with the system and, what our expectations are.
We received information that it was a burglary in progress. As we arrived on scene, we noticed no physical signs that the door was actually broken into. As we got inside, we noticed 5 gentlemen, and I noticed a gun in somebody's waistband. I never recovered that gun, but I have reason to believe that he shook it into other places.
You said there was a firearm, right?
I believe there was a firearm.
Now you believe there was a firearm.
Yes, sir.
My client here, he just shook it down his leg and the firearm disappeared?
I wouldn't say shook it down his leg.
Where did it go?
Where did it go, sir?
Yeah.
I never recovered it, but at the time I detained him and had him sitting, so I wasn't worried about the firearm.
I have nothing further.
So, you were doing great on direct. I wouldn't really add additional information. You started trying to guess what happened with the gun. You guys have anything?
The truth is the most important thing. We would much, much rather you say, I don't remember, rather than try to kind of make it up, because it's going to go bad.
A busy officer could have 100 open cases at a time, and they're in and out of court every day. There are a lot of cases in our system where the sole evidence against the defendant is a single police officer. If you have a police officer getting up there and said, here are the drugs that I took out of that guy's pocket, that whole trial could take 15 minutes, and that's a criminal conviction on someone's record. Now, if you work at Dairy Queen like I did in high school and you lie at work, maybe it's not the end of the world. But if you're a police officer and someone's liberty is at stake, it matters.
I don't have a police officer running over here telling me every time there's been a problem. I don't have them saying, here's the key to our personnel files. The police department gave a lot more information before Larry Krasner was elected as the DA. There was a real comfort in doing that because the information came and it sat. And then all of a sudden it stopped coming over in November.
We're missing a word here. Both photo arrays not disclosed to defense.
I really think that they were already changing the way they were doing things in anticipation of him walking in through the front door on January 2nd of 2018. Hey, Lieutenant, I don't want to drive y'all crazy, but just in my experience, it's always so important to be able to look at the original because copies don't always come out real clear, and I want to make sure we're not missing something. Right. Yeah, so you guys would make us a copy and you would give us a certification that you're giving us a true and complete copy of the entire file. I like it. I like it. Thank you, you too. Bye-bye. I feel like I'm getting the runaround from him, but he was very nice.
It's fine.
District Attorney's Office.
The last few weeks have been pretty intense. After Larry asked people to resign, tensions immediately flared. People were fearful that they would be next.
I cracked a joke at my going away party at the public defender's office. The worst part of my day was going to be going up and down the elevator. Totally true, 100% true. There was just this overwhelming negativity and awkwardness. What am I going to say? I can't say anything to the people whose friends all just got fired and they all think Larry's a dick. He did need to do a house cleaning. He did.
Well, nice to meet you guys. I'm Dina Baslin. I'm Senior Policy Counsel. People don't like to change the way they do things, and they certainly don't like to be told by outsiders that the way that they do things is wrong. So I've just been trying to be so nice to everyone, like so nice.
Larry's not going to allow them to do things the same old way, so get with the program or get the step in.
I've been in the juvenile unit in the DA's office for the past 13 years. Juvenile's always been a little bit on its own little island, which has been lovely. Hopefully that will continue.
A key leadership hire within the DA's office.
Bob Listenby is the new first assistant district attorney. He plans to work on juvenile justice reform.
This man essentially ran juvenile justice for Barack Obama and Eric Holder.
Hey, morning.
I've been working with young people for most of my adult life. My first work with them was actually in 1969, which goes back a long ways.
Here in Philadelphia, you can be charged with shoplifting and end up going into placement. These are dangerous facilities. Some of our kids get hurt or even killed in some of these facilities. You don't take kids charged with misdemeanors and put them in detention centers.
When I entered the delinquency system, I was only 13 years old. My mother thought I would be safe. She didn't realize that I would be abused, strip searched, mistreated, or I wouldn't be able to continue my education.
I got 10 punches from a guard for not doing the schoolwork.
Three-quarters of the kids in placement are African-American kids or Hispanic kids. Very few white kids are going into placement. Kids who are going into our system, they come out often worse than when they went in. You have to recognize that the prosecutor holds a lot of the cards. What the prosecutor will recommend will often be followed.
We don't have a perfect system, but we have a decent enough system to get services available. We have treatment programs. We don't call them prisons. These kids are removed from home, and it's not to be taken lightly. As prosecutors, you take that into consideration. Does this child need to go to a facility? Have you tried all options in the community? I have 3 teenagers, so I know exactly the kind of issues that these kids are going through, which I think is pretty crucial, because I think if you're not used to being around kids or teenagers, you're gonna kind of write them all off. Kids are kids, and you wanna see them succeed, and you wanna give them a chance.
I value the people who are working in our juvenile unit. I've tried cases against them in court, but they worked under an administration that did not have a mandate from the people to change the system.
I've known Bob almost 20 years. When he came here, I was excited because we always had a really wonderful working relationship. I always felt respected and appreciated by Bob. There's no doubt.
Good morning.
I really appreciate you guys putting together the dashboard that summarizes the data for juvenile court. But when you look at the number of placements, they're going up. And I think we have a lot to do about it. So I want to reduce the population at the detention center by 2 kids a day. What are we doing to accomplish that, Lisa?
So we tried to go through and change how we handle the morning lists. I brought an example just to show, like, we have all these kids.
Is this going to reduce the kids to 2 a day?
That we can control?
That we can control.
I know that's your goal.
Yes.
I would like to say, sure, let's see how this works. I mean,
Megan,
we've done what
what
we
do you
think we can
think?
do.
I think it's a good first step to say 2 a day. It depends on what kids are on your list.
Right.
So it could be that there's a list where we have everyone we're fine with releasing. It could be that next day that we have super serious crimes and maybe there aren't that number.
Can I just say something? I do not buy the inherent assumption that you all are making that kids in Philadelphia are worse than kids all over the state of Pennsylvania and worse than kids all over the country. Kids all over the country and kids all over Pennsylvania are being released and not sent to placements as much as kids in Philadelphia are. Why is that? It's because it's our culture and our practice, and that's what we've been doing now for years and years. And we got to change that. We can't just continue with the status quo. Our assumptions are the things that are keeping kids in placement longer. Our assumptions, not somebody else's, the people sitting around this table.
But Bob, let me ask you, I mean, what do you see that we're not doing that you want to see? Because we're really kind of at a little bit of a standstill of knowing who's our population, who are the kids that are being held. What do you think we're missing, I guess, when it comes to that population?
There's no justification for what we're doing, guys. There isn't. You know, except we've been doing it for a long time. And that's not a good enough justification. It really isn't.
If you want to know what it's like to look at a kid whose life is being just destroyed by us in a system, you know, I know them. I see them when they get on the adult side. I've gone over and tried some of their adult cases, and you know, you say, well, where did we go wrong? You know, we went wrong because we just. We've gone wrong because we haven't changed the system fast enough to address their issues. Some of these kids I've known for 10 or 15 years. And we just haven't addressed their problems. We have not addressed their problems. They come into our system and we just push them through. We can't do that anymore.
Let's do your hair.
That's that Puerto Rican hair.
When I was a kid, that was the same thing.
I'm gonna get some of my hair.
But we didn't have gel back then, so it was just wet and then it'd be poof. You know?
He's a little shy. When they were growing up, he would say, I'm gonna be a Marine and a cop, just like my dad. And my daughter would say, I'm gonna be a cop too. Now they both say, we're not doing that. Because we're constantly sitting here during dinner talking about cop stuff and things that happen throughout the day.
And then every piece of advice leads to somebody dying.
You can't go to the movies because people get killed there.
Have a good day. Be good.
Bye-bye.
Hispanic female, race, shirt, jeans. What's your name?
Platoon. Draw. Weapon.
Sir, 2 platoons formed and ready for inspection.
Captain, everything good? Yes, sir.
Holster your weapons. Replace your magazine.
At ease. We just went over at CompStat. We're up by 50 guns that we've recovered. Right now, we are leading the city in gun confiscations, so thank you all for the work that you're doing. We want to make an impact on those shootings, then we got to get those guns off the street. They're still out there. We had a shooting at Broad and Lehigh right now. The shooting's on the uptick again. So in everything you do, no matter what the assignment is, just use extreme caution. Does anybody have anything for me? All right, thank you. One of the concerns for some officers is how their name gets on that DA's list. Ready?
Yes, sir.
Nobody wants to work with a bad cop. But you have good officers who might have had some mishap or something that wasn't interpreted properly, some personal issue that puts them on this list. We're taking 24. Now you got a good cop who becomes disgruntled, says, you know what, I'm done. I'm just not gonna go out there and hunt, you know, and make those arrests. And when you tie those guys down, or when you get them to overthink, it's the community who's gonna suffer. Does he have an apprehension or any injuries to police?
There's been a circling of wagons that protects police misconduct when it comes to the police department. And what we have right now is, had a wagon leave the circle.
There's never been a clear policy that we on the outside have been able to discern from the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. Sometimes things are disclosed, sometimes they're not. And what we're hoping to do is establish a workable policy that complies with the United States Constitution. They've had over 50 years to get it right by now, and they haven't.
If I got long arms, we're good.
Yep.
Yeah.
The list that came up before seems to have, I think, 3 categories of police officers. There's officers who seem to have problems with telling the truth. There's officers that seem to be abusive and beat people up. And then there's other.
We are going to have more categories than that. Typically, most offices, in addition to figuring out what goes on the list, they also have policies about when you take people off the list. I don't think it's as black and white as that.
Well, I think it actually is black and white. I think that once they're on, they stay.
Oh, well, we were saying something totally different than what I'm saying.
Yeah, I understand that.
Okay.
No, I know,
And I don't know that I
exactly.
agree with you on that. I don't know that I believe that once you put somebody on the list, that they stay on the list forever. You know, let's take a good cop who just screwed up and got a DUI. I think you want them to feel like their name could come off the list at some point. We've got to keep, as much as possible, some goodwill going with these folks to get their buy-in, so hopefully we get the really bad, nasty shit out and y'all get it and you do with it what you think you can in a courtroom.
I've been a public defender now for 40 years, and I've been doing issues involving police misconduct since 1995. The federal government indicted a series of police officers for misconduct.
6 Philadelphia officers have pleaded guilty. They planted phony evidence, stole drugs and money, sent innocent people to prison.
I thought that someone needed to reopen all the cases involving corrupt police officers. No one had ever done that before. Unfortunately, the district attorney's office, while it's supposed to act as a check on abuse by the police, all too often sees themselves in bed with the police department. We went to the police station and they brought out 300 file boxes.
Now, as a result of the scandal, 55 convictions have been overturned so far.
This is one of the best days of my life.
So as a result of this DA's do not call list, I filed one mass post-conviction petition with 6,100 different names on it. Each one of these people had been arrested by any of these police officers. There'll be a number of these cases where people are in custody, we'll get them out. There's a number of cases where people are on probation or parole, and we'll get them off probation or parole. Same police officer. Theoretically, if we had all this information beforehand, the disruption in all these lives would not have occurred.
We need to figure out why are the cops not sending us any information. You know, of course.
When is it supposed to be sent?
We haven't gotten anything from them since November.
Let me just do this. Let me try to reach Commissioner Ross. Hey, Commissioner. Don't worry, I'm sorry to bother you. I just wanted to mention 2 things to you.
The police department has been working on compiling their documentation, and I felt like everything was amicable. They promised that they were going to get the first round to me several weeks ago. All of a sudden, I don't get anything. They know I'm not going to let go, and I just can't believe the police department would want to be on the wrong side of that. I just don't understand.
I do want to meet like about treatment for my center thing, just because I feel like
You can meet with me anytime. Stop.
I know,
pretending
but
like
then
it's
you'd
hard.
be.
I'm not gonna make it hard.
But
Lisa.
it
Hold
is
on.
hard. I mean, I could include
come
Drew
with-
on it, and then maybe he'll schedule it.
Just send an email to you.
Okay.
I'm always gonna.
You know what I mean? Because like
I'm
treatment
always
court,
gonna meet with you.
I know you
period.
say that, and you're gonna cancel on me.
I'm not gonna cancel on you.
Okay, well,
All right.
see you.
So, you got a lot of files in here.
I do. So these are the pre-trial. This is a pre-trial list from last week, which I have gone through file by file. I don't understand what the mission of the juvenile unit is, other than processing files. We drug test every single one of the defendants, regardless of whether or not we think that they have any problem with drugs. We have them all do a lot of community service. I mean, it's just like, it's sort of like, it feels like a menu.
Now you know. You know a lot more, and it's scary. It's downright scary. We're the ones creating the problem in family court because we're causing kids to be held when they shouldn't be held. We are doing that.
I feel like we rope these kids in and then they just end up getting placed because they can't
That's
meet all
probably
the
what's happening.
conditions.
So the question becomes, what set of policies do we fashion? And that's really where you come in to help us fashion those list of things that we need to do in order to make this work.
Well, Lisa is supposed to bring more numbers to the meeting. I mean, I reminded her. No.
You have to remind her several times because you just have to remind her because I've asked for this stuff. This is the 3rd time around.
I know.
So I'm not going to ask again. I really want the information this time. So I'm at my wit's end in terms of being patient to get the information. I didn't think it was going to be like that because I was very clear about me wanting it. And the fact that it didn't happen is a direct, it's kind of insubordination in a way.
It is. There needs to be an office-wide, a message about how you respond to leadership here.
Yeah, I'm nice, but I'm not going to be pushed over on this kind of thing. It's got to be some, pretty definitive stuff. It's going to be our way. It's going to be a highway in some sense. So.
Yes. All right. I'll see you soon.
Thanks.
When kids are in trouble, this idea that the juvenile system is helping, it's just not always true.
One kid had an $173 retail theft from Target, and he didn't even get away with the stuff that he tried to steal. And he not only had to pay restitution, but also was in placement for over 9 months. And his mom died while he was in placement, and when he got out, there was nowhere for him to go.
The law gives all prosecutors' offices a huge amount of power, but I fundamentally don't buy the idea that we can fix people in the criminal justice system. I don't pretend to know what the answer is. I just kind of feel confident that what we're doing now is not working that well.
I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a prosecutor that didn't say, hey, we could make some changes. We could, do things better.
One of our policies
A lot of people who've come in now, they see their role as to change the system and in a global level. But that's not helping the person that was robbed or that person whose house was burglarized. You can make the changes. I just think you don't have to destroy the system to get the results you want.
So the press framed the list of tainted cops that your office is compiling as one of your office's biggest projects. Is that accurate? Did they get that right?
It's a big project, partly because of the history of the city. City Hall is the center of the city, and there's only one statue of any recent mayor, which is up near City Hall. That is a statue of Frank Rizzo.
You're dealing with criminals, with barbarians. You're safer in the jungle. This police department in Philadelphia could invade Cuba and win.
He was a beat cop, and then he was the chief of police.
Frank Rizzo has been called the toughest cop in America, and that reputation has made him a hero to lower middle-class whites who think he may become the toughest mayor in America.
In the 1960s, he became the mayor, and he was brutal and racist.
Police in the city of brotherly love shoot about 78 people a year, and about 1,100 complaints of police brutality are filed there each year.
Things got so bad that the U.S. Department of Justice brought a lawsuit against Frank Rizzo.
Philadelphia today was charged by the federal government with permitting police brutality on a scale that shocks the conscience.
According to the suit, the victims were overwhelmingly black or Hispanic.
When Rizzo left office, the culture within the police department was solidified.
The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson will be delayed briefly in order to bring you the following special broadcast.
Until today, there was a house in Philadelphia filled with people who for years confounded everybody. They called themselves Move. They tried to live in the city as if it were the forest. They offended the neighbors first and then the city. Today, the city went to move them, and there was tragedy.
The Move house exploded into flames soon after a police helicopter dropped an explosive charge on the row home's rooftop bunker.
65 homes were burned to the ground. 6 Move adults and 5 children were incinerated.
The entire city block looks like a war zone.
The fallout encouraged young Philadelphians to fight back. And they went into federal court and they were able to win cases.
No matter how ridiculous it is that there was a weapon, that there was an assault, that there was an attack, this is a standard cover-up tactic.
What's happening now is that Larry's able to do it on a big scale.
What about the police department?
Well, you know, there's 2 sides to this. One is the actual police department consisting of living and breathing police officers, many of whom are people of color, many of whom would like not to have corruption supervising them. On the other side, you have the Fraternal Order of Police, which is their union. It's their bargaining unit. There are roughly 14,000 members. More than half of them are retired police officers, but are in a position to control its leadership and therefore control its policies. It's a voice that is overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly white. The FOP is the voice of Frank Rizzo's generation of cops.
It does no one any good to have a dishonest cop, a crooked cop. It leads to mistrials, it leads to watering down charges and plea deals, it leads to prosecutors losing cases outright.
It's also how guilty people walk. Guilty people walk because of that.
So, a couple of detectives conducted an illegal search, and that severely compromises the strength of the case. So now we're losing a homicide case, or maybe losing a homicide case.
Our neighborhood was rattled by a shooting this afternoon.
The 23-year-old man was shot. He was rushed to and pronounced dead at Penn Presbyterian Medical Center.
You just had to know him. Tafari had the most beautiful smile. This was my boy. This might sound strange, but I hear my son in this house a lot. And I can tell when he's with us because we still feel his presence. And, you know, sometimes people will walk in and be like, well, what's going on? And it's nothing that they can understand. Yeah.
We received evidence from a defense lawyer
that has 2 homicide detectives searching a cell phone without a warrant and then lying about it. The case law is very clear. You cannot look through people's phones. You need a warrant. They did it literally under the surveillance camera. Very good quality. Like, the police misconduct is not usually this clear. That is Detective Mole, and that is Detective Murray, and that is what we are alleging is the defendant's cell phone. The timestamp says 3/31/45, and the warrant was signed at 8 p.m. And when the defense lawyer asked Detective Mole, did you look in his cell phone to see if there was like anything there to like give you new leads? Detective Mole said, not yet. I waited until after we got the warrant. It's critical evidence in the case, the cell phone, the messages on the cell phone. They're like basically just a play-by-play of the murder. If this case is not provable, the biggest reason is because these cops didn't give a shit to do it right.
Can we do a search warrant? Who the phone belongs to?
The phone doesn't exist in the eyes of the court. The phone doesn't exist because it was in a pocket, in pants, in a bag, and we didn't have a warrant.
All right.
No, I know. Keep thinking. Never stop thinking.
I was thinking about him every day, like, it's crazy. Like, my brother gone, and like, he having a trial. And then the bad part about it is, what if, like, we don't get justice for it? That's just the worst part about it. It could cause a whole commotion, like, if they let the person out, yeah. My mom would be devastated if they just let the person run free.
Isaac. Come on, where's your sneakers? Okay, I'm ready, guys. I'm getting ready to go to the car. I'm very anxious, just to find out the results. A lot of prayer. When you have younger children, it's not easy simplifying things to them. And if this doesn't turn out for the best, to have to stand there and hear them say that the person that murdered your brother is going to walk away because we can't prove it. We know it, but we can't prove it. Before I go, where does the police commissioner stand on this in reference to the behavior of the detectives? What would be done in this situation, not only for my son, but for every black man in Philadelphia?
I cannot speak for him, but I can say this. I know they pulled these guys out of homicide right away. They're not on the street.
So you do me a favor.
Yes.
The next time you see them, you ask them this question for me. And that's all I want to know. Some kind of closure. Why? What benefit did it do for them to tamper with that evidence? It wasn't a police officer on the street that picked up my son's limpless body with 11 bullet holes in it that took evidence and tampered with it. But for the detectives that's supposed to be investigating, to do the right thing for the justice of the city, to behave that way, despicable.
I totally agree with you, and I will do anything I can. Okay. All right. Listen, I'm happy to talk to you, Ken.
So these are policies that we're all in support of, we can all agree to, we can all train our attorneys on, work with. Lisa and her team, why don't you guys walk us through any changes you think need to be made?
So this was a policy that we thought we had discussed and you had agreed with us on about if it's a felony, you gotta call it what it is. Most of the time this comes out if it's a robbery. I may offer simple assault and theft, right? But once I bring my victim into court, I'm gonna move under the robbery if that's the appropriate charge.
My understanding was we walked away from it where people were comfortable with the language where appropriate.
My understanding was it was next by Bob. So I have a hard time going up to a victim and say, hey, I know you were robbed, but rather than robbed, I'm just gonna move on that you were assaulted and something was stolen from you. Like that to me is, to us as prosecutors, is not acceptable.
I'm a prosecutor now too, so please.
So we move on the most appropriate charge at trial.
Whether you describe it as a misdemeanor or a felony, doesn't mean anything to the victim. It means something to you.
It means something when they step into a courtroom. I'm telling you now. When I have to bring my victim into court, have them miss school, and then to say to them, I'm not gonna move on the charge that is the most appropriate charge under the law, is very difficult for us. I don't wanna butcher the law, and I have a hard time having my prosecutors do that.
The only purpose of dinging that kid on the felony is that it's gonna raise his prior record score.
Say like we would take total offense to the language,
yeah.
saying that we're trying to go after the highest felony that we can get. That's I mean, I'm sorry, that's like almost ridiculous to say.
So if we did not offer it at pretrial.
So then should I not make the offer?
No, not talking about F1.
Make the offer.
The hypothetical is an F3.
They're two different, but yes, we do. Yes, we do. It's a robbery. We can play with it all we want.
Wait, no, let me finish.
This language is saying.
No, let me finish. Let me finish.
Let her finish.
That's not what the community wants to hear.
I'm in the community and I talk to them all the time. I'm a member of those communities because we're really talking about African American communities for the most part. And yeah, they will say that the kids are out of control, but they don't mean that they want the kids to penetrate the delinquent system. What they want is they want more rec centers, they want more programs, they want services, they want things, they want the schools to be better, they want things for the kids to do so they can have adult.
There was this weird thing that happened where the people who stayed saw themselves as the progressive people in the office. It was like they were the progressive people in the old world. And we like took the paradigm and took it and put it someplace else. We weren't even having the same conversation that they had been having before.
If the kid's selling drugs, the kid's selling drugs. It is what it is. Like, I'm not taking it and making it to be a bigger deal or a lesser deal than what happened. Whatever the reason is, it's easy to paint us as the big bad prosecutor because it fits what they want to believe about us rather than really what the reality of the situation is. We're in Philadelphia. We have a lot of crime. We have a lot of guns. So I think just to say prosecutors are causing mass incarceration here would be an easy way out.
All right, so should we do the drug testing thing here? Like we shouldn't drug test kids just because?
That same kid could be at home with his mother, making all kinds of mistakes, and we just gotta wait for him to grow out of it. And we gotta love him through it without being shipped off someplace.
Okay. I love talking to you, Ebony, because you make me feel like I'm less crazy for thinking the things that you think them too, and then I'm like, okay, well, but from my perspective, what I do see is like these meetings where we're hearing the same things about like, this is not my problem. These are the obstacles. Like, it just seems like there isn't a lot of actual progress being made.
I think what might be beneficial, patience and empathy.
Empathy, okay.
And empathy because here's a person who has done this work for probably her entire career, and literally in one election have someone say, nah, 30 years for nothing. You're actually hurting kids. You're actually ruining lives. You're actually in the way. I don't know, that might be hard. And so a little bit of empathy around that.
Okay.
There's probably no more sacred obligation that a prosecutor has than to turn over things that are helpful to the defense in one way or another to make it a fair process. Now that we have set up this police misconduct database, and now that we have policies of turning over this information and turning it over early, this is a fundamental radical change in how the Philly DA's office has operated.
If you had subpoenaed before, 2 p.m. that Friday or any time before that, it wouldn't have caught these officers that were added as of Monday. As best we can, we try and run officers that have like a large amount of cases, but we're not going to catch them all. In order to kind of modernize the way in which we subpoena officers, the tech guys put together something called DA Workstation. If you happen to subpoena anyone who is on the police misconduct disclosure list, you would get a big red warning at the top. If it's a presumptive officer we're not calling, the subpoena won't go through.
We've got to make sure that prosecutors are getting all the information about a case from the police, then the defense is getting all the information from the prosecutors, and as Dr. Phil says, people who have nothing to hide, hide nothing at all.
We showed the entire trial division the damaged goods folder on the screen. Hopefully that gave them some perspective as to what we're working with.
Yesterday was one of the few times where me not knowing many people was a real advantage because I didn't know these people well enough to know how ugly they were being to me. Yeah. Andrew did. Andrew was getting really angry with them because he said the hostility was...
Yeah.
One of the issues was the prosecutors were frustrated about us disclosing to the defense so early. They don't like the idea of the disclosure being made before the preliminary hearing because preliminary hearings don't deal with credibility. I don't agree with them, but there is a very easy, workable solution to accommodate for their concerns and not give up what we're trying to do. And that is, No,
we believe in transparency. They're going to have to get used to it. Their reaction to this comes out of a decades-long culture of not just holding the information back, holding it back forever, shredding the information, having two files, destroying the information. I mean, that is a culture that needs to have its spine snapped. And the best way I can think of to do that is to just make it really clear that that will not be tolerated at any level. The other aspect of it is this. Officers make a ton of money off of overtime, and they make the overtime off of testifying. So what we're doing by revealing this stuff early and making it an issue with their supervisors early is we're getting some of the police department supervisors to think twice about whether, Officer X here, who helped his girlfriend's running a business of prostitution, whether he might need to be in the cat up a tree unit instead of in some kind of patrol unit where he's going to go to court a lot.
Helps everybody. Listen, we might affect police misconduct, actual police misconduct, because they might get the message that if they do something, it's going to be public, very public.
We requested that the police departments send us information, and they just got back to us. I don't know how accurate any of this stuff is. Part of the problem is we're not getting original documents. They instituted a redaction policy not in connection with any kind of conversation with us. It just shows that they don't trust us with the information. The bottom line is, this does not have half of the relevant information we need.
So I'm late because a friend who's a judge in Texas is in Philadelphia and he wanted to have lunch. So I hardly ever go to lunch. So, and I didn't. You're looking at me like I was drinking or something. I wasn't drinking.
Do you want to be?
Wouldn't mind leading into this, maybe.
So they sent all this to us in a way that they thought we were not going to be able to sort it. Like, we sent them an index, they didn't respond back to the index.
We were at least being nice. You told me not to be. Oh, yeah. I'm just like, is this just untenable? I mean, is this just something where we say what they've done is untenable and that we're not gonna try to process it? I mean, I gotta ask that question. I mean, this is so ridiculous what they're doing, right?
Yeah, they're just messing with us. And some of these officers testified yesterday, so.
You know, at what point do you kind of throw down the gauntlet and say, let's do this a different way rather than trying to do it together as partners? So I'm struggling with that.
We need to get extremely broad information from them. We need to turn it over redacted, but we need to get it unredacted. They can't be the judges of what we're allowed to see. They will always, they cannot help professionally, but always shade it in favor of non-disclosure. That is totally unacceptable.
Yeah.
That is not the way this is supposed to work, and we have an actual obligation to go after them to get it, even if they don't want to give it up. Although I think the much bigger picture here is called the FOP. So, I mean, it may ultimately turn out it's just better to go to war right now.
Philadelphia's police union has filed a lawsuit against the city's district attorney, mayor, and police commissioner.
The union's attorney says the do not call list violates certain rights,
including their ability to perform their functions and their due process rights. We don't know how an individual police officer could challenge being included on such a list.
I don't have any kind words for the district attorney, and he knows that. Enough's enough.
Even though the police department gave us information that is heavily redacted, it has enough information to build up our own database.
If you don't know Larry Krasner, if you had a dealing with him, you wind up on that do not call list.
There's about 50 names that we need to go on the list because they are officers who have been arrested and convicted of a crime.
We have enough officers on that do not call list to invade Cuba. It's really sad.
There's about another 140 names, and that's what came from those hidden files. So the list is going to double in size within the next 2 weeks. There are some very prolific officers on here that it's going to shake the office, including homicide detectives.
If you're too corrupt to testify in court, you're too corrupt to patrol the streets. If you on that list, you're gone. This should be done.
You will no longer abuse your power because you will answer to the people, and the people will judge you. That's right. Off the streets! Off the streets! Off the streets! Off the streets!
We're here to make sure that we send a message to Larry Krasner that we have the officers back.
Thank you, Ted. That's amazing. Allow me to begin by acknowledging that it is an honor to host this panel discussion. We are extremely grateful to have all of you participating. Additionally, I'm humbled by the amount of people who have showed up here tonight. Thank you to everyone in the audience. Tonight, we want to have a conversation that pushes us towards reimagining justice in the United States. So we're using the second episode of Philly D.A. as a catalyst for discussion. But it is important to note that all of the issues presented in this episode are themselves national in scope and very similar from city to city and state to state. Please feel free to put questions and comments into the chat box, which we will monitor throughout the session. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can. If your question is meant for a particular person on the panel, please indicate that in the chat. And also, please tell us your name and affiliation if you have one. I'd like to introduce the 5 panelists who will be joining us tonight for this conversation. In alphabetical order, they are Leon Ford. Leon is an author, activist, survivor, and role model to so many of us. More about that later. David Harris. He is the Sally Ann Semenko Endowed Chair and Professor of Law at the University of Pittsburgh. He studies, writes, and teaches about police behavior, law enforcement, and race. His most recent book, A City Divided, Race, Fear, and the Law in Confrontations. And he is the creator of the outstanding Criminal Justice podcast. Larry Krasner has been Philadelphia's district attorney since January of 2018 and was reelected to a second term by a considerable margin last week. He was formerly a defense attorney as well as a civil rights attorney in Philadelphia who represented groups such as ACT UP, Occupy Philly, and Black Lives Matter. Ted Passon is an award-winning filmmaker and video artist who created and produced Philly D.A., along with Yanni Brooke and Nicole Salazar. Autumn Red Cross is the founding director of the Abolitionist Law Center's Court Watch program. Autumn served as the inaugural Gaultier Community Engaged teaching fellow at Duquesne University, where she obtained her PhD in communications and rhetoric. Ricky Olds is a graduate student in our new MA program in Applied and Public Sociology here at Duquesne University. He is a public educator, motivational speaker, a social justice advocate, as well as the executive director of the House of Life Pittsburgh, a reentry program that has grown out of our work in the Elsinore Bennu Think Tank. On top of all those noteworthy accomplishments, he's also an all-around nice guy. We're going to break up the conversation into 3 topics, one on police community relations, one on juvenile justice, and a final one on reimagining justice in our democracy. For the first topic, Larry, first, allow me to congratulate you on your impressive win last week. Many of us find a lot of hope in what you're doing in Philadelphia. Second, specifically with respect to your efforts with the Philadelphia Police Department, what did you learn in your first term, and how do you plan to use that experience in your continued efforts?
Well, thank you for having me. Delighted to be here, and also kind of delighted we got reelected, because if you read the mainstream press, it should have been a landslide the other way. So let me just say, read the mainstream press and then read the people, because that might actually work out better. So what did I learn? One of the things I learned, and I learned it from a police officer who's a good friend of mine, is that these police unions are controlled by their retired membership. Let me repeat that. Philly has a huge police department. It's depending on the year, it's about 6,500 people. It's the 4th largest police department in the United States and the 6th largest city. But not one of those police officers who are current needs to vote for John McNesby for him to be the incumbent leader of the FOP. Because for every current police officer who is an FOP member, there's 2 or more than 2 who are retired. And it should not surprise any of you that if you take a prior generation of police in the city of Philadelphia, you're going to find that they are demographically less diverse, that their politics are more Republican, and you're going to find that their attitudes about policing were formed by a guy named Frank Rizzo, who was a beat cop, and then he was police commissioner, and then he was the mayor, and who frankly stood for 2 things, racism and brutality. And when you came up under that, you were instructed in that. There was no accountability for that. and you're sitting in your lawn chair in some other county, when you end up in that position, you're going to think that absolutely everything we're trying to do for criminal justice reform is bad. I would point out that I was endorsed in 2 consecutive election cycles, 2017 and 21, by the Black Officers Association in the city of Philadelphia. So it is not the case that every police officer thinks the same way. It is not the case in a diverse city, and Philly is a diverse city, that all the cops look the same or think the same. But it is the case that the unions, for the most part, are a throwback voice from the past, and their leaders exist for the purpose of their own incumbency. They don't actually exist to help cops at all. The leaders exist because it's a very, very powerful and often extremely well compensated position. And they're going to talk the craziest Trump talk they can talk to keep that position, because they know who they're really playing to. It's the retired members.
So this question, I had an informant to come up with this one, Larry. Can you tell us about the first time you met Philadelphia Fraternal Order of Police President John McNesbitt?
Yeah, I can tell you about that. It was about 20 years before I ran for DA. I was in the middle of a lawsuit involving corrupt narcotics cops. And guess who pops up with his name as having been close to this illegal activity? One John McNesbitt. So, in my capacity as a civil rights lawyer, I was taking his deposition. And he was just as nasty and surly and Jabba the Hutt as he is now, pulling out pictures of his kids to wave them at me because I was doing something terrible by asking him questions and making him tell the truth. John is just what he is. I don't even know if he means it. I sometimes think he's just like a really good actor, and he probably voted for Bernie Sanders. But John is a cartoon character for a kind of Trumpian fascism. And for brutality and racism. I mean, I will not keep going on and on, but let me just say, this is a guy who defended Nazi tattoos visibly worn by police officers. It is a guy who described Black Lives Matter in 2017 as a, quote, pack of rabid animals, unquote. This is a guy who never called what happened to George Floyd a murder. And after the verdict came in and the verdict came in against George Floyd, he sent out some bizarre tweet to members of the FOP telling them, to go home safely and have a good night. This is a guy who allowed the Proud Boys to come inside FOP Hall in a members only section to drink with them, and then lied about it and said he didn't. He has never used the word insurrection, and he has endorsed Donald Trump twice. He is a straight up fascist fool. That's who he is. And I met him 20 years ago, and he hasn't changed a lick.
So do you like him or not?
Well, I must say he does make me chuckle sometimes. He really does. And he did a lot to get me elected, because the more he says I'm terrible, the more I win.
Thank you. David Harris, progressive district attorneys like Larry face a backlash based on the perception that they're either actively seeking to harm the police or at least preventing them from doing their job. What might a path forward for DAs like Larry? What might a path forward be for them to win the hearts and minds, or even find common ground with police on this issue look like?
Well, the most important thing, Norm, and let me say I'm honored to be part of this this gathering, and to have the privilege of speaking to so many people about what we've seen here tonight. Most important thing is not to go necessarily to find common ground with the police, but to do what Mr. Krasner has done, which is to go out and win the election. Once you have your hands on the steering wheel, things look a lot different. It's no longer an abstract argument about ideas and principles. It is very much a practical argument. And so I think it'd be great if there were ways to appeal to those many officers who probably like the idea of getting rid of corruption in their midst, because it makes the job worse and more difficult for them. But the most important thing is to get the power that the office provides. That will give any discussion or leverage a much more real feel. And I think that will help people come around. They will see that the world is changing, not that it might change or something like that. They've held power a long time. What we've seen in a lot of these cities with district attorneys cut from the same cloth as Mr. Krasner, cities like Chicago, cities like San Francisco, cities like Boston, cities like Los Angeles, is that the old guard is not about to loosen its grip or to give up. They're suing George Gascon in Los Angeles. They have done everything they can to cause the failure, not accomplished so far, of the progressive DA's administration in St. Louis, in Chicago. When the voters respond, no, actually, this is what we want, as they just have in Philadelphia and as they have in Chicago, the fight may go on, but political power has shifted. And the people within policing who actually want these kind of changes, they were already there. What has to happen is the city, the power structure, whichever city we're talking about, needs to move on and understand what the voters actually want. The voters are ahead of the FOP and the police department in Philadelphia. There are people who, of course, agree with those positions of the FOP in Philadelphia, but their numbers are becoming smaller. And it's very clear what the course should be. So I would say to people like Larry Krasner and his colleagues in so many other cities, in which DAs now represent something like 20% of the American population, are within jurisdictions that have a progressive DA, I would say keep voting, show what you want, be engaged, demand the policing that you want. And the progressive prosecutorial movement will carry on. This isn't a flash in the pan, flavor of the month thing. We can see that these people are being reelected just like Larry was.
Thank you, David. Leon, this is sort of a follow-up to the question I asked David. You're the survivor of a police shooting who has been able to make the incredibly difficult decision to engage and work with police in an attempt to address some of the issues that we're talking about here. Can you offer us some insight based on your experiences?
Yeah, thank you. I feel so honored and privileged to be a part of this panel. I'm a huge fan of you, Mr. Larry Krasner. I've been watching you for years. And David Harris, it's been a while. I miss you, man. We got to catch up. Yeah, so I think, obviously there's a lot of division and it's easy to pick one side or the other. For me, this year, my interest has been, how do I get different people around the table to have difficult conversations, right? My work with the Pittsburgh Police, it hasn't been easy. I know, Norm, I could think about maybe 5 or 6 years ago how optimistic you were in telling me, hey, you should think about working with the police. And then, this year, when I decided to meet with the officer that shot me, you were like, you shouldn't do it. You're like, don't do it. I'm like, dude, like, what's going on? So I had to do a lot of internal work, and I think that, on both sides, right, healing needs to happen. And I'm talking about real, self-reflection, self-awareness. Because, I think there was times where, here in Pittsburgh, Bill Peduto would say something and I would be completely triggered by it, right? But now he could say the same thing, or someone else could say the same thing, and I may have a little bit more compassion and understanding for, what they're trying to say. I see, and I work with activists who are severely traumatized. And if someone say the wrong thing, they be ready to light the whole city up. And then I have, worked with police officers who are also severely traumatized. And if, activists or someone say the wrong thing, they completely shut down and don't want to engage in the conversation. And so I think that it is important to recognize that no matter what your perspective is, when I got shot, there were people who believed it was justified. There were other people who believed it wasn't justified, right? No matter what your perspective is, I believe that you should be a part of the conversation. And, we should be able to, come to some type of consensus. Another thing is voter education. People, really don't know much about, who to vote for. And I think that is important for us to continue to pound the pavement and to, engage people in these different elections. Here in Pittsburgh, I know there's been issues with our district attorney, and a lot of people want him gone. But like you said, David, he continues to win, right? And so I think people really, need to, educate themselves and also show up and vote. The last thing I'll say is, I hear a lot, and I've heard a lot about the FOP for years, and I don't even know who they are, right? I don't know who their leadership is, and I'll be really interested in building those types of relationships, right? Just to get an understanding of how they see the world, and how we may be able to influence them if that's possible. So I think that this is what community is all about, right? And I'll send you a link, but I'm doing an event Thursday, and I have a former white supremacist on a panel with a guy who started the Bloods in Dallas on a panel with a jeweler, right? And so people from very different backgrounds, and the thing is, when you learn people's their story, when we learn how individuals learn to see the world, right? What their lived experiences were, we can tailor solutions for them and people like them to make sure that they're on the right side of history.
Thank you, Leon.
Thank you.
All right. I'll try to give you more advice and then change at the last minute as we move forward in this relationship. So one thing that comes to mind listening to you, all of you, a good friend of mine who's a police officer says, well, how can people on the left like you, Norm, be super union and Pittsburgh people, right? Working class people, and then come out against the police union. So I wonder if David or Larry have anything. David, go ahead.
Sure. I don't think you'd find anybody probably in this whole Zoom room who is against unions or is against people bargaining for working conditions and wages and fairness and things like that. The problem comes with the fact that for years, and this developed as far back as the 60s and 70s, you had cities which often very strapped for cash, and the police union contract would come up. And well, we can't give you much of a raise, but we can trade off some of the disciplinary process to you. We can give you control of things like that. We can support efforts to put into state law binding arbitrations, those kinds of things. And that was a great deal for the union in the long run, because they have been able to use it in order to not just to protect members of their union, to make sure that they get fair hearings and things like that, but oftentimes to protect people who nobody ever would want in policing anymore. And they have amassed a lot of political power around that. So it isn't a matter of union or not union, as I see it. This particular set of unions has decided that its agenda is no civilian control when they can avoid it, no civilian oversight, and we protect our people, public interest and public safety often be damned. And that simply can't, that's just different than, say, a union that wants fair pay for picking up trash or for any other municipal function that you could think of. We have to get back to a place where the union can certainly bargain for the things we care about unions bargaining, but that accountability, transparency, and discipline are the business of the people running the police department and the civilians in charge of it, not the other way around.
Thank you, David. Let's go to Will Meadow, a graduate student, also a graduate student in our Applied and Public Sociology MA program. Will has a question from the chat.
Yeah, it's sorry for anybody if I mispronounce your name, but from Dr. Califoot asks, for those of you who study trends in policing, is there any data or is there data to support that the newer generation of police and those going into academies are not, Job of the Hutt, as Mr. Krasner described, them Job of the Hutt, Trump troll type people, that they are from a newer generation, a newer way of thinking?
That's a good question. And I don't study this per se, but I do get to spend a lot of time with new police recruits, and they're not. They're very different. They're not like this. And I don't know if Larry and David have any thoughts.
I guess my experience is like Norm's. I don't find that the people are uniform in any respect. And I don't find them all sharing the old attitudes. The danger is that a culture can affect everybody from throughout the organization. And if the organization's culture does not change, the young folk who want to advance will have to adapt to that culture and adopt it. And that's just no way to go.
Even taking that a step further, the young recruits that I work with, one thing they all share is a desire to help. They all want to help in some way. They all mean well. And they impress the hell out of me in so much, I can't even get into it. At the same time, as David was saying, it's a problematic culture, right? Police officers die 15 years sooner than most people, right? I think that's a product of a lot of things, but the isolation and alienation of that culture is a huge part of that. Any other questions? Dee, do we have any of the folks that want to ask questions?
I'll turn to Yusef to ask a question. Yusef Jonas.
All right, thank you. I was sitting there first. I feel the pressure to perform here, but I also was wrestling with typing a question. Now, for me, I got some pretty strong opinions about restorative justice, community involvement, and community input in as oversight over police misconduct. My question is, with institutional racism permeating every aspect of our society, what do you think, talking to both Mr. Krasner and Mr. Harris, what do you think the better course of action is in the progressive messaging for defunding the police, or how do we go about addressing that misconduct without alienating the rest of the community?
So thank you for the question, Mr. Jonas. I'm not sure I have the best answer, but I can tell you that, in many ways, the language, and I'm glad we have a communications PhD on this call. Perhaps we'll get her input, but I can tell you that the language around defunding the police reminds me a little bit of the language around the movement against apartheid in South Africa, where people didn't quite know what divest meant. They don't quite know what defund means. And I do think it's ambiguous language that can be scary to some centrist voters. I think a little more clarity would be useful. I, for example, do not advocate the complete elimination of the Philadelphia Police Department. I do not advocate, and I respect those who do, but I also don't advocate the complete elimination of custody. I actually do think that, people who murder people might need to be in a jail cell. But I do think that there should be a very fundamental reimagining of criminal justice and how that system works. And it should, we should not have a country that is the most incarcerated with a 500% increase in the incarcerated population, and jails and prisons where there is no rehabilitation, no education, none of the things that obviously work extremely well in other countries to keep down crime and to keep down incarceration. So, I would articulate this without using the word defund, because I think it's confusing. I think that the system has to be fundamentally reimagined in a transformative way. It has to be downsized. Many of the things police do, they have no business doing. They should be done by other entities. Obviously, I'm not doing a real good job of reducing that to a different phrase. But I do think that it's problematic language in that it's being used by the enemies of a grassroots movement for criminal justice reform to stand for only one thing, which is the complete elimination of any form of policing and any form of custody. And that is a notion that is frightening to a lot of people, and I think does not help us to get there. Now, having said that, divest actually was the phrase they used for South Africa. And ultimately, what they were trying to get done in South Africa happened. You did have the end of apartheid. You did have, Mandela running the country. Some good things came of that. So I could be wrong, but it just feels to me like the language is too ambiguous and it's too susceptible to people like Tom Cotton picking it up and making hay.
Thank you. Well, since you brought up PhD in communications, let's go to Autumn Redcross, my friend, for her take on this, and if she wants to move into the bigger court issues or any of the other things that might be relative to her work.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I wish I had some type of written format to address these questions that you raised, but first off, I should clarify, my PhD is in the philosophy of communication and rhetoric, and a lot of people are confused about what that is. And we mostly investigate the how and why we communicate what we do. So it's a little bit different. It's not like we're studying communicative forms like the microphone or the being on TV and that type of stuff. Ours is a philosophy of rhetoric. And I think that it does move into the ideas of what policing is, what incarceration is, and the ideas of divestment or defunding or even abolition. And I am from the Abolitionist Law Center. It's right there in the title. So we do believe in abolition. We also believe in working with people to reduce harm. I think one of the problems with our language around the whole carceral state is how we frame crime. I was able to work with and follow alongside as some colleagues of ours met in coalition to describe reimagining policing. And one of the first things that they did was break up the different areas that we find ourselves calling on the police for. So like you said, Larry Krasner, you said that you believe that the police are called on for a whole bunch of issues that maybe they shouldn't be. And I believe that that's true. We have these different buckets that we're calling on to police for, like as though they are there to solve everything. We sort of rely on them as though they're the heroes of our society, as though they're some superhero to us. And we may have those experiences, right? We may know people who have made a huge difference in our lives or have helped us to escape some great harm. But as a culture, we don't understand other ways of seeking help. And we don't really know where the boundaries are. So we're calling on our police as a 911 asset to come to the rescue for all these various reasons that they might not have good knowledge of how to assist. So we broke the categories up into homelessness and drug use and mental health, right? And these are areas that, maybe a police officer is not the best person to call on. Like, you wouldn't find yourself calling on me a PhD in rhetoric and the philosophy of communication for any one of these issues, but there are specialists and there are people who are trained who might be better situated to respond. But a big category also that we took a look at was just the subject of violence. And I think about how we frame violence in our minds and in the way that we speak with one another in our discourse, right? In our communicative vein. And you might ask yourself, or if I were to ask you, what is violence? Maybe I'd get a whole bunch of different answers. But there's violence that could be direct, right? Direct harm on your body, somehow taking away from your ability to experience fullness of life. So if that's the answer, then there's a spectrum of violences, aside from directly being accosted to your body or struck or something like that. There are other types of violences that we sustain. And if that's the case, how should we meet or help steer people towards healing in those cases? I just think that those are some of my immediate thoughts with those ideas in mind, with communication, with the way we frame the idea of defunding and divestment. So really, where should we be putting our support? Should it all go into police who are reacting to the situations that they're being given? Or should we take some of that money and put it into other areas that could benefit our community in a way that we wouldn't have to be calling on the police for things like homelessness and drug use and mental health?
Thank you, Autumn. Ricky Olds, who is an all-around nice guy, as we all know. Ricky, you know how I see this, and you know that I have a concern that this is a hard left group, obviously, right? And we love Larry and we love what he's doing. And it is making this big difference in 20% of the population. However, there's 70 some million people who are going to take a look at or be shown everything he's doing in Philadelphia as a worst case scenario and tell me why I'm wrong.
How can I tell you why you're wrong? I have no idea what you're talking about, Norman, as usual. But I don't really think you're wrong. I just believe that we have so many different people in so many different stages of growth and development and life experience that we can't possibly try to come up with a one size fits all. So earlier when you said about the left or the right, I think none of us created those paradigms. So I think that we should be bigger and more imaginative, excuse me. So why must we fit somewhere left or right? How can left or right actually define 350 million people? I don't really think that's possible. And so if we spend all of our time trying to make everybody else think and do what we would think and do, we can only have chaos. But if I decide I won't react to the things you do, if you're not directly harming me, then my job is just to live the best way I can and do unto others. It's really that simple. That seems so small, but it's really that simple. I would never presume to tell you how you should think or feel. However, many of the people that want to solve problems are trying to solve the problems with the same mentality that created the problem, trying to tell other people how to live and what they should think and what they should do. I think that's impossible.
I appreciate that. But my concern, and this is to the whole panel, is 2 summers ago, we have everyone marching in the street and it seems like things are going our way. At the end of this summer, they're trying to take Frederick Douglass out of the high school, right? So when I think we're being successful and things are going our way, there's always a hard backlash. And I'm really interested and concerned about how do we deal with that? And that's to anyone on the panel.
Norman, once again, like, we don't have to deal with that. What you can only do is the best that you can. We really can't come to a consensus about Frederick Douglass because everybody is not going to feel the same way. And they get to do that. This is supposedly America. You get to do that. What we cannot do is discriminate or punish people for feeling, looking, or thinking differently than we do. And that is what the country is founded upon. We cannot get away from the original America. Black people were incarcerated into the country. Black people were the chattel slaves, and they were also the means of production. And so police forces and these things grew out of that. And so we can't forget that. We can't just assume, like, there's a reason these things happen in Philadelphia. There's a reason they happen in Chicago, Detroit. They didn't just happen in a vacuum. And until we understand exactly what happened, then we can never approach a solution.
Thank you. Larry, again, much like with the first question, what have you learned in your first term dealing with the issues of juvenile justice, and how's that going to help you move forward?
So I'm going to answer that question after I answer your last question, which
Okay.
is,
thank you.
So, I do not think anybody should be pessimistic about what is happening right now in the United States. 10, 15 years ago, you had 0% of the population with a progressive prosecutor. 2 years ago, you had 10%. Now, right around George Floyd, we have about 20.1%. It might be more than that, as I think Mr. Harris said, about 70 million people. But they are in Chicago, they're in these big cities. They're actually controlling the course of more than 20% of the criminal cases. LA is the biggest criminal justice jurisdiction in the United States. We're controlling about 30% of the criminal cases. And it turns out, and this does attach to juvenile justice, that you can slam the brakes on this nonsense about as quickly as you could build it up. So in Philadelphia, for example, when I came into office, there were 600 plus Philadelphia kids who were in faraway placements, basically snake pit kid jails around the state. That number is now a little bit over 100. That is an 80% reduction. And we did that in 2 years before the pandemic hit, right? It means something when we have gone all of a sudden to the point where 30% of all the criminal cases are being handled by progressive prosecutors. Doesn't really mean anything about us. And honestly, that's part of the reason I submitted to Ted Passon and his evil plan to do a docuseries, because we are ordinary people. There's nothing special about us, but we are the lawyers that every movement needs. They need to keep them in the background mostly, but we're the ones that movements need to be technicians. This is a grassroots movement for criminal justice reform all around the country. And it's not just going to affect what happens with criminal justice, it's going to affect democracy. Because what we see in these cities where you start to talk to unlikely voters, reluctant voters, maybe voters about something they care about, which is criminal justice reform, is that they vote. It's not the usual nonsense tug of war over some Reagan Democrat, which the Democratic Party has stupidly engaged in for decades. This is a question of getting people out to vote who felt completely separate and unrepresented in the system. Every time I have run, there has been a bigger turnout every single time. And if you look at where criminal justice is on the ballot, not because of a candidate even, but because of an important measure, not every single time, but time and time again, you'll see unlikely voters coming out. It's because we're talking about something that truly affects people, unlike the usual nonsense most politicians talk about, which doesn't truly affect people. So I think we should be optimistic. I don't think we should be pessimistic. Every great social justice movement is going to take something like 30 years. Where are we now? I don't know. Let's start with Michelle Alexander. That's about 10, 13 years ago, something like that. We're probably less than halfway there. And yeah, there's going to be zags. Obama sadly may give way to the worst president of my lifetime, at least for 4 years. There's going to be some zags, but I think we should be very optimistic about what we are seeing happening in this country. And I think we should be very hopeful about that. In terms of juvenile justice, in addition to the data I just gave you, I'll give you an example of how criminal justice reform can slam on the brakes real fast. It used to be that there were a hell of a lot of cases that ended up being resolved in adult court where the defendant was a juvenile when the crime occurred in Philly. And that's because there's a systematic effort to basically get rid of the juvenile system and treat all juveniles like adults, including this nonsense rhetoric about super predators and so on, for which the Clintons, share some of the blame. Well, I can tell you that in Philadelphia, it didn't take us long till we got to the point where out of the approximately 2,400 juvenile cases we have a year, only 7 or 8 are resolved in adult court. And that includes homicides. Pennsylvania is a state where every homicide is required to begin in adult court, and it's a state where juvenile court has no jurisdiction after age 21. Other states do things very differently. They can supervise you or they can incarcerate you well into your adult years, not in Pennsylvania. So I'm telling you, even in a state like that, we got it to the point where 99.5% plus of all juvenile matters are resolved in one way or another, including restorative justice, in juvenile court. Remarkable change is possible because prosecutors were given so much discretion and so much power at a time when they all wore devil horns. Well, here we are. Some of us are flapping our snowy white wings. And what we see is that now we have the discretion and we have this tremendous ability to reverse the course of this madness.
Thank you, Larry. Will, questions from the chat?
Yeah, we have a lot of questions in the chat. Going to go back a little ways. I think this is to everyone, although it was Mr. Harris, Mr. Krasner, we're talking a lot about it. Is there a way this is from John Checkle. Is there a way for police to unionize without resulting in a weaker system of accountability, an alternative to the FOP or their current model anyway?
Sure, they could do that, but it probably doesn't surprise you that they don't want to. They have been very successful at persuading state legislatures across the country to give them what, just my opinion, are special rights. They don't think of it that way, in forms of these laws called Officers' Bill of Rights. And that gives them the right to not have to talk to a supervisor or a prosecutor or anybody for 72 hours after an incident. Gives them the right to do lots of things that you and I would not be able to do as regular citizens if we were suspected of some kind of criminal misconduct. So it is certainly possible to imagine a union being a regular union of policing, but they want to have control of the disciplinary process, of accountability, and of transparency. And they just like things the way it is. It's no surprise that in the episode that we saw, the hardest thing for the office to get out of the police department are those lists of misconduct. They don't want that seen. They do not want to have to be accountable in the ways that anybody else would be. And so I don't know that it's a question of simply forming a union that wouldn't have that kind of power. You're going to have to grab it back from them. It is going to have to be pulled back. There have to be changes in state law. There's no alternative. There's no real alternative.
Anyone else on the panel for that question? All right, well, what else do we have?
We have a question for Ricky from Ashton.
No, we're going to can't. Ricky's fired.
from Ashton Cutler Larkin. You say that we cannot ask people to think the way that we do. And he said I'd agreed to an extent. Yet you also say we cannot discriminate. There are many people who are very racist, transphobic, queerphobic, and they use these beliefs as building blocks, and they gave Trump as an example. How do we or you find it in yourself to let them think this way when it's that thinking that is in itself discriminatory, and by association it can hurt you and others?
With all due respect, if I say what they think is wrong, then is that not the same mentality that tells me what I think is wrong? There's really no difference. I just think we can't be allowed to take what we think and use that against other people. That's what I'm trying to say. I don't think it's really that hard, because honestly, if we treat ourselves in a certain way, it does not matter how other people attempt to treat us. We don't have to be reactionary. I think we should be reactionary in how we feel at all times. We don't have to react to what Donald Trump says. If I love you, I don't stop loving you because he says I shouldn't love you. That's ridiculous.
Will, another question.
Yes, this is for Mr. Krasner from Ali Chimenko. Do you, from the video, do you still have to keep adding police officers to the do not call list? And are you still going to enact a plan or have enacted a plan for these officers to get off of the do not call list? Is that worth it to you to pursue that?
So our police misconduct database has a subset of officers we think are so dirty that we feel like it's an ethical problem for us to put them on the stand. As for a lot of the officers, we think it's okay for them to testify, but the defense has to have the information because the Constitution says so. It may or may not be admissible in a courtroom, but at least they got to get the information. So we don't really call it a do not call list. We call it a police misconduct database, but it does include some people we think are that dirty. Yeah, we have to update it all the time. We have to be open to the possibility somebody should come off of that list because, you know, that's fair. And so they're contrary to everything you heard from that fountain of misinformation. All these officers are notified. If they're on a list, they're all given a chance to come in and tell us why they shouldn't be. Their lawyers are available. The FOP pays for those lawyers to come in and tell us why they shouldn't be on there. And this whole thing has gotten so heated and so divided that we have at this point sought contempt against the Philadelphia Police Department for not turning over documents that we insist we're entitled to have. And we're going to have a hearing coming up, I think actually this week, we're going to have a hearing coming up where a judge is going to decide whether they are in contempt of the law for not giving us the information to which we are entitled. Mr. Harris is right, though. Heaven knows they like their money. And even more than their money, they like a caste system in which, you know, as Autumn Red Cross said, they're the heroes of society. They have a status that is higher than anybody else. When one of them is harmed or killed, and that is obviously a terrible thing, the whole world stops. You know, all elected officials run to the hospital, something they don't do. When, you know, a wonderful father who's a construction worker falls off of a high steel building. It's like all of that stuff is going on. But they really care about our not knowing the truth about some of what some of their worst people do. We should not lose sight of the fact that when you got 6,500 people, I don't care what they're doing for a living, some of them are going to be dirty dogs. I mean, that's just how it is. So that doesn't mean they're all dirty dogs. There's a lot of really wonderful, honorable, decent cops who are in there trying to deal with a culture and trying to deal with a union that would almost rather stick up for the dirty dogs than stick up for the integrity of the profession and the safety of the officers who are actually trying to follow the rules and the relationship between police and community. That's how far we got off the beam. But, you know, once again, I think Mr. Harris is absolutely right that the progress of criminal justice reform and policing is inextricable from the progress of democracy. And that means getting people most affected by it to vote. And God knows they are not going to vote unless they feel like there's something to vote for.
Leon, you put a long quote in the chat, which tells me you have something you want to say. What's up?
Oh yeah, so there's a book that I really love by an author named William Ury, and it's called The Third Side, right? And it takes two sides to have a fight, right? Just the third side can, you know, help solve a problem, and I think that, you know, in our society, there are two sides, but I believe that there are more people on the third side, and if we can help, you know, arm those people on the third side and give them the tools and resources to help, you know, mediate situations or solve problems, I think that we'll be in good hands. Me personally, I mean, I sit in the middle of a bunch of different perspectives, right? I mean, I have, you know, family members that I love, I respect, but I don't always agree with, right? And we're able to, you know, have powerful dialogue, and I take that, you know, approach to the work, right? And so, like, my grandma's neighbor still has a Trump sign up, right? And I remember I was filming with a team for like Oprah Winfrey Network. And when we were pulling up, they were like, "Oh my God, this guy's racist," but this guy, he's an old white guy, and he looks out for my son and my nephews, and looks out for my grandma. What he think politically, like I never would have thought, he was a racist, and I still don't think he's a racist, and I don't pay him no mind. I don't pay his Trump side no mind at all. It doesn't bother me at all. And I think that, as a society, some, people do things for many different reasons. And if we could just focus on the solutions and focus on people who want to work with us, then it's cool, man. And there are people who will work with you that don't agree with you, right? It's just how you frame the conversation a lot of the times. And when you're severely traumatized, and we've all been severely traumatized for many different reasons, it's hard to approach those conversations. So I just would encourage people to just be open-minded, man. This is a very complex issue, and it's easy to own your perspective and try to force everybody around you to think the same way. But people, have many different lived experiences, and not everybody's going to see it the way you do. And, I think, I would want more people to be curious, sincerely curious, to learn why and how people learn to see the world the way they do.
All right, so we have about half an hour left in this meeting, and I'd like to take some time to think about this idea of reimagining justice, right? I'd like to start with Ted, because I think as a filmmaker with this project, and I sat through it again, and I find it very inspiring. And the DA you hired, Larry Purnell, the first one you hired, that story is so great. And I'd like to talk to Ted about what he feels the role of a film like this, or a film series like this, is in helping people and helping our democracy to reimagine justice.
Yeah, I think there's probably a few answers to that question. I think a lot of this at the end of the day comes down to storytelling. I think a lot of it, if people are presented a certain narrative by a lot of different sides, who are trying to control the narrative, and so it can be hard to essentially make sense of what's going on, especially if you're, if the position you're trying to present is not something that feels culturally ingrained, or something that feels like you have a shorthand to talk about it. Whereas, for a lot of people, the idea of, crime happens, and if crime happens, and it's the fault of everybody in the law enforcement community, prosecutors, police. So, there's like an old, like very kind of tired story about that you don't really have to explain to people. You can kind of just say it's a shorthand. Where on the other hand, if you're trying to reframe the conversation, you're trying to come in with new ideas and a new paradigm, not only do you have to, the burden is on you to explain that, which takes a lot more time, which is a lot less snappy, which is harder to hold in people's brains, but you have to do it over and over and over. There's a lot of repetition. And I do think that one of the roles of storytellers, especially documentary, I think a great role for documentary is that I do think that these stories and these ideas can be more easily understood and can sit with people longer when they're actually attached to real human stories, and when they actually come with human empathy alongside of them, rather than just kind of abstract ideas. I do think there are times when really snappy and jaw-dropping facts and figures can really stick with somebody. But I think at the end of the day, I think we all, I think storytelling is such a powerful tradition because it connects us to, we can imagine, we can project ourselves into the situation. It feels real when you have that emotional connection. And so I think that is certainly a role that storytellers can have, is to find those things out in the world that are, outside of the media cycle. And I think that, the news media has their role, but they also have the beast to feed. They have to turn around really fast. They're not doing that kind of longitudinal storytelling or journalism that I think is kind of the missing piece here. And so, hopefully we've added to the conversation to some degree with the series. But I think that's a big part of it. Yeah.
Thank you. I think you've added a lot to it, and I take great heart in it. Leo, I'll go back to you because I like you the best. Oh, and I'll take the Trump sign down. I'm sorry. I didn't know you noticed. I'll keep watching your kid though. What's justice look like to you in the future?
That's a very hard question. Very hard. I know when I got out, so Thursday actually will mark 9 years since I was shot. And almost immediately I began this journey to justice. And it was almost, it's just like an immediate response, right? Justice for Leon, justice for Leon. And I never really thought about what justice was, right? And, I think about the scales of justice, right? And, the restoration of balance. And then I would, question, right? Is it even possible to restore balance in a system that has done so much harm, right? Like even if I began walking tomorrow, you can't take away from the trauma, the pain, the grief that my family and I experienced, and so like, this idea of justice, it's a tough concept, right? But looking forward in the future, I think about my son, right? I think about a society where people aren't preyed upon, right? I think about a society that is truly rooted in fairness and equality, and it takes all of us to make that happen, right? I get asked this question a lot, how are you preparing your son for the world? And I always respond with, I'm not only preparing my son for the world, I'm preparing the world for my son. And each of us has a stake in that. Each of us have to make a conscious decision to add value to the world around us in a way that's going to have a powerful impact on our children. And do we want our children to grow up in a world where there's so much hatred, division, and trauma, right? Or do we want our children and grandchildren to truly live prosperous lives, regardless of what they look like? To me, that's what I focus on, right? Is how do we create a world that is safe for everyone, and where all of our children have access and can succeed.
Thank you, Leon. Autumn, same question. What does justice look like in the future?
Big question. I was just reading Lori's quote in the chat. Dorothy Day years ago talked about creating a society where it's easier for people to be good. Such a simple and profound concept and so hard to make happen. I think about the guilty. We don't have, it's hard to have those conversations because we like to defend the innocent and make sure that the innocent are treated well, because we're all innocent until proven guilty, but some of us are guilty. And then what? There's no incentive to be guilty. It's not okay to be a wrongdoer. And so, of course, I think about what I see as a court watcher and in the court watch program, and how we see how people are treated, just confronted by that system. And we see the reasons that people are going to jail through the court system, and we see the atrocities that they're suffering in jail, no matter where they stand at the outcome of their trial. But I also personally think about this idea of justice because of my own experiences. a long time ago, 11 years now, I lost my brother to street violence in Philadelphia. It was 2 years before the defendants were found and ready to go to court. And I went down to Philadelphia and witnessed the whole trial. And although my brother was shot by only one of those people, they were both found guilty of all the charges that were put before them. And they were both sentenced to what would be a lifetime in prison. That's what was told to us by the DA. That's what was told to us by the police in an attempt to comfort us. You know, they would say to us things like, oh, we've got your guys and they're going to jail. They're going to do time. They're going to do a lot of time for what they did to you. And you know how our culture is. We're so competitive. We're so into sports. We're so into winning, right? So the situation felt like that. It felt like a competition. Well, we do have an adversarial system of court. So there's always a good side and a bad side. There's always a winner and a loser. But at the outcome of that trial, I felt really contorted because I felt, you know, relief for my mother, for sure. But at the same time, I felt concern for my sister-in-law, who was a recent immigrant from France and didn't speak the language. And I felt concerned for how she would traverse society now without her husband to take care of her and her children, without her husband to go to the store or to help her around the house or anything that needed to be done for her and the family that he had built in Philadelphia. And I also felt grief for the other two young men. They were all in their 20s, who were taken from their families as well. So there were 3 young men taken from the community at that time. And to me, that wasn't winning. And I felt like, well, who's going to do these things to take the place of Philippe, my brother? Who's going to visit my mother? Who's going to stand in for his children? And I felt like the guys who did this, the guys who were there, they should be taking care of my family. I'm in Pittsburgh. I'm far, far away. So to me, justice would look more like that, where the gaps are being filled in for the harms that are done to our communities and to our families. I think that's what I would look for justice.
Thank you, Autumn. Larry, since Autumn took us back to the streets of Philadelphia, maybe you could go next.
Wow, what would justice look like? Well, that was pretty cool. I got to say, Autumn, I think, had a really interesting notion there, a much more restorative notion than what we see. I don't really have a great answer for you, but I'll give you a little not too bad answer, which is, I think it looks a little bit more like what you see in modern Germany. Most definitely not what you saw in World War II or in old Germany, but modern Germany is really very different. And its most obvious characteristics are, you got about 1/9 the level of homicide as the United States per capita, meaning according to the number of people, and you got about 1/9 the level of incarceration. And if you actually go into a German jail or prison, which I've done, what you'll see is that it's all about human dignity and it's all about rehabilitation. And so specifically what it means is people are not wearing prison clothes, they're wearing the street clothes. People are not in their cell most of the time. They're actually able to walk around and go around different places in the prison. There are language classes in German because so many people who are in the jails are actually immigrants. And so they are paid to take German 1. They are paid to take German 2. And they are paid almost the same money you would make on the street to do industrial type work. Obviously, what they're getting at is they're trying to equip people who are in custody to go back into German society, to speak the language, to get a job, to keep the job, to be able to turn away from whatever got them into jail in the first place and do something else. And most importantly, it actually works. This is a country with no death penalty. It's a country where every single person, no matter how serious the crime, is considered for parole at 15 years. You could kill 7 people. You're considered for parole at 15 years. You may or may not get it, but simply put, it works. I mean, yes, there are other things that help that society that we don't have, like it's not soaked in guns. It's not soaked in opioid pills, which happens in our country. To some extent, there's national health. I don't know all the specifics on that, but they do just a better job of providing for the basics. And despite its terrible history and terrible legacy, it has even in recent years shown a level of inclusivity in accepting large numbers of immigrants from other countries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it looks a little bit more like that. It looks a little bit more like a system that is based on fundamental commitments to human dignity and to rehabilitation, a society that doesn't see punishment as valid, frankly. It sees rehabilitation and restorative activity as essential.
Thank you, Larry. Ricky Olds, Justice in the Future.
Wow, that is a hard question. Whatever justice is in the future, it can't be what we've seen in the past. I don't think there's ever been justice in American society, ever. And I think whatever justice we do have is some type of vigilante justice. And I don't really think that's justice either. I think that, like somebody just said in the chat, if we could just create a system where it's really not that necessary, if people just treated each other in a certain way, we wouldn't have the need. I don't think there's ever a system that will dispense justice. I just don't think that can happen. I think people have to be just in their dealings with each other. It would be much easier for individuals to dispense justice to each other than a system to dispense justice to strangers. Because there's many populations in our society today who have never been afforded humanity. And I don't think people who have never had their humanity called into question can really relate to people who have never had humanity afforded to them in the first place. Because there's a reason why people would harm each other in such a way. Like black on black crime would seem to be ridiculous, but it's not when we realize the self-hate that's been created in these people by the treatment of the overall society, the same systems that we're talking about. So we can't go to those systems. A system can only give you what it's designed to do. We can't go to those systems and ask for justice. We have to ask justice of ourselves and each other.
Thank you, Ricky. David Harris, my friend, the podcast is called Criminal Injustice. So what does justice look like?
So many incredible, wonderful answers from so many people here. I guess to me, I would look for number one, if we think about the enforcement we have now, I would think it should be the whole thing should be smaller. The footprint should be smaller. The footprint of systems of incarceration and policing should be smaller. We should deal with the problems that those systems are dealing with now that they're not suited for at all, with people who are suited to working in those problems and arenas. This was already referenced earlier this evening. Number two, I would want to see, to the extent that we have these smaller police departments and systems, they need to learn their history. This is referenced by Ricky just a minute ago and by others. We have to understand where policing came from, and we have to understand the history of individual police departments when people are about to put on that uniform and put on that patch, because that's the only way that they will know what that uniform and patch means to all of their citizens. And that's the only way that they can actually approach people and understand their reactions. And I guess another thing I would hope for and look forward to is that when we have individual problems, our system is built upon adversarial forms of argument and justice. That's true across the law system we have and that many countries have. But when we're trying to solve problems, that gets in the way. And the only way to learn to solve problems is to think in terms of systems. How is the system that what Ricky was referring to just a minute ago, and what we saw really worked on in this episode of the documentary? How is the system off? How does the system need to change? What pieces of the system are making this damage occur? What pieces of the system are allowing these unsuitable people to continue to be police officers? If we only think in terms of individual cases and in terms of who's to blame for this shooting or that, we'll never get improved at all. So I guess overall, I'm looking for the entire effort to be smaller and to join that with many of the suggestions that I've heard from my fellow panelists. The regard for human dignity, the regard for restoring everybody involved in the process, all of that must be done with a much lighter touch and a smaller hand.
Thank you. I would be remiss if I didn't just respond for just a second, because, I mean, I agree with what he said fundamentally, but the thought process, those police officers that Mr. Krasner, all he wanted to do was put them on a list. But whatever they did, had I done it, those same prosecutors would have been like, how much time do we give him? Like, should we put him away forever? Or should we give him a break and give him 5 years? But the thought never occurred to them, like, I shouldn't go to jail, or these police should go to jail. So we think in those terms, and we got to get rid of that whole thought process.
Thank you, Ricky. Will, the group, any good questions in the chat?
Yeah, there are a lot of questions that we haven't gotten to yet. So let's see here. There was one. Going back a little bit, we were talking about the juvenile system, and I think when we talk about justice, it's actually very helpful to think about this question. So Shelley Bastos asked, when we think about juvenile justice, will family court reunification policies also be looked at for reform? There are children in foster care that can easily wind up in juvenile placement, and can we make a difference when the whole family has a chance to be helped?
Who wants to take that question?
I can say that prison is full of people who were in foster care.
No takers. Will, next question.
This one is sort of goes to our area. I think a lot of the people on here are either from Pittsburgh or have been transplanted to Pittsburgh. And it asks Mr. Krasner, how can we get an integrity unit established in Pittsburgh? How can we establish something like what you have in your office?
Great question. You can call my office and I can have you talk to Patricia Cummings, who is a wizard and who ran a unit in a different city. She's now run a unit in Philly. She's off to her next chapter and her next adventure in the near future, but she is plugged in to a national network. There are people out there who want to do this, and you absolutely should reach out and we will help you any way we can. The best way to get her, I'll put it in the chat, her email address, but whatever help you need, our policy team is happy to try to connect you to the right people. I would also suggest you talk to Fair and Just Prosecution, which is an important organization out of LA. A woman there named Miriam Krinsky. It's basically the clubhouse of progressive prosecutors, and they share best practices, connections, contacts. One of my colleague progressive prosecutors actually started a unit. I think it was Kansas City, Kansas City, Kansas, or Kansas City, Missouri, I forget, but he started one there, and some help came from Fair and Just Prosecution. I'll try to put those into the chat for you.
Thank you. Dee, who's another of our master's students in the Applied and Public Sociology program here at Duquesne. She has a question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. So a few weeks ago, we had done a panel entitled Marijuana's Disparate Racial Impacts, a Restorative Justice Issue. And one of our panelists was Lisa Boving-Learned, who was a retired police sergeant from Florida. And she talked about ways to measure policing and its efficiency and effectiveness. And she talked about how the common measurement for this is number of arrests and tickets, but then went on to describe in detail how that measurement is highly problematic and suggested that the absence of crime might be a better measure. So I was just kind of wondering what you all thought about that, or what ideas you might have for measuring the actual effectiveness of policing and how society could take steps to change that.
That's a great question, Dee. I think your guest put her finger on something very, very important. You get what you measure. And it's easy to measure arrests and tickets because you can just count them. It's important to measure things that we actually want. So first you come up with the list of the kinds of policing and the kinds of things you want. You want more community interaction, as our newly elected mayor-elect is talking about. Well, figure out a metric for that, count it. Because you will get what you count. If you want people to on the police force to relate more to youth and work more with young people, figure out ways that they can do that, offer them those opportunities, and make clear that those will be counted when it comes to promotion time, when it comes to time to reward them. So I think that's a great point, and it applies to many fields of endeavor, but to policing particularly, because for so long they've used that very simplistic metric.
Thank you, David. We have time for maybe a couple more questions, but before we get to that, this is a very inside out thing to do, and the national headquarters did it when they did their Zoom with Larry a few weeks back. As people are leaving, I'm going to ask everyone to share a thought, an insight, a reaction in the chat as a way of closing this. So every single person here, please share that in addition to all the questions we already have. Will, another question.
This is sort of an adaptation of two questions and the recent conversation that we've had. So we've just talked about what justice looks like in the future. Is the justice that we imagine in the future, each panelist imagines in the future, does that include the police, at least in our understanding of it, or some modified form?
Not everyone all at once, please. One at a time. If it gets any more wild on this panel. I think that says something. Another question, Will.
Okay, this is a question that I have. Dr. Redcross brought it up, but there are multiple sides to crime. There are the people who commit these acts and people who are impacted by it, whether it be individuals or society. In what ways can we include the people who have been impacted by crime in the justice process without potentially violating the rights of the people going through the justice process, with the emotion of being and the impact of being impacted by crime?
This is really important. Go ahead, please.
Mr. R, please.
There are a few things from my perspective that you can do or participate in. We're now trying to develop a community participatory defense hub which is a group of community members, volunteers who come together to talk about particular people's cases and to offer non-legal suggestions, but they help to support the defense of people who were confronted by the system. That's one way. Of course, court watching is another way of getting involved, and brainstorming with other court watchers about solutions for community and for community members through the system. And to just touch on the prior question, absolutely. I believe policing has a lot to do with it, and there are different ways that we can reimagine policing. And I immediately think about simple things like maybe police shouldn't be stopping for traffic violations because of the impact that we see, or the tendency for traffic violation stops to escalate to higher offenses had by police themselves. So yeah, definitely police are in the conversation for the justice system, and there's a lot of things that can be done and are being done. I know that LEAD is working in Allegheny County to find diversion opportunities for the police here. And Dee, I did want to say, you probably already know this, but Allegheny County is unique in that we have over 105 separate police departments all feeding into Allegheny County Jail, whereas a county like Philadelphia has one. So when you're tracking types, you're tracking information, you're pulling from a huge pool that has several hubs pouring into it.
I guess I would just want to add on the question that was just asked. I think it's important to think of intervening before things happen. One of the things that the data on deadly violence in this country tell us is that the victims and the shooters, if you want to look at it that way, either one of them could end up on either side of the gun. And the important thing is to get to them with the needed services, with the violence intervention, with the good education that we all think everybody deserves. All of the things that will make people whole and make them good people, if you provide them ahead of time, that's your best shot at heading off eventual disasters. Instead of thinking, how can we help the victims without disadvantaging defendants? And I was a public defender myself, so I think in those terms. I guess I would encourage us to think ahead and to look for ways to keep this from happening in the first place. Again, thinking in terms of systems and interventions.
Leon.
Yeah, to David's point, I think about my life, right? And two parts of my life. When I got shot, I went to therapy and, did all that stuff, but I never had a chance to talk to a therapist until 7 years later when I willingly set it up myself, right? And I think about when someone goes to, if I would go to the ER today, I would leave with discharge papers and say, follow up with your PCP in 2 days or something. And if I don't follow up with my PCP, my doctor's office will call me and say, hey, we see you were in the ER on Saturday. We want to get you scheduled. What happens is, if someone is a victim of a shooting, right, they survive, no one's following up on their mental health, right? And we know that they're struggling with PTSD. I have some friends. I have a friend, right? 3 different friends right now serving life sentences for homicides, right? In middle school, right? We all lost friends. One of them lost his dad to gun violence. So they were already exposed to gun violence, struggling from PTSD. These aren't bad dudes, right? And so one solution that I'm always thinking about is, and I'm a huge advocate for mental health, right? how can we not only get the victims resources, but their entire families. An idea that I had was we have these shot spotters here in Pittsburgh. And so like gunshot goes off, there's a shooting, within minutes, the police will be there. Now, what if we have the data? What if within, 3 to 5 block radius of this shot spotter, we're not only talking to a victim, but we're talking to the families, getting a resource, because it's not normal to hear gunshots or witness people shot, or see your neighbor one day, then the next day, he or she is dead from a shooting, right? So what if we actively had a mental health approach to help some of these young people struggling with PTSD? Because nobody wants to just wake up and take a life. If you go to the club on the weekend, I have friends, they might take a firearm, and for me, I'm like, yo, if you feel like you got to take a firearm to the club, why would you even want to go? But they're severely traumatized, and they're not able to really think differently. And so we have to, as a community, we have to help them, and we have to help our younger generation who may be growing up in these types of environments to prevent them from being shooters in the future.
That's my man. Thank you, everybody. We're over time. I want to really thank you all so much. I want to thank Lori Pompa and everyone at Inside Out, and for sure. I also want to thank this panel so much, and all the people that came, so many more than I thought. Larry and Ted, thank you both so much. Either one of you has a parting thought, I'll give you the time that we don't have, and people can stick around or leave.
I mean, Ted ruined my life, but I still like it.
The same thing to me, so I get
it. I would just say thank you to everyone for coming. And if anybody was interested in showing Philly D.A. In another school or another community, we have a website, phillyda.tv, where you can find information to set up a screening or to buy the educational version of the series for a school. And if we can help you coordinate something like that, we're happy to do it and keep the conversations going.
Slippery Rock and WVU, we saw you out there, so we're counting on you. Larry.
I mean, I already said it. Ted ruined my life, but I still like him.
All right.
Hey, listen, we're hiring at the DA's office. Some great chiefs of staff, some lawyers, mid-career, early career, late career.
How about late career professors?
Professors are a whole different species, but yeah, we'll take some of them too.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.
What about Mr. Krasner hiring some people from the community, like community liaison officers? Maybe they didn't go to college, but they really got some ties in the community, and maybe the DA's office would come out better if they had allies in the community.
Larry, before you answer that, let me point out that Ricky is my research assistant, my graduate assistant at Duquesne. Worst mistake I ever made.
You just blew my whole credibility.
Well, obviously, Ricky, he's not paying you enough, so, direct message me.
No, it wasn't for me, but Philadelphia is like my second city. And I'm on the board of Acre down there. I know you know Mark Bookman and Bradley Bridge. And I campaigned for you from Pittsburgh with a lot of returning citizens because we felt, the old adage that all DAs were police in a suit and all judges were just DAs in a robe. And I think you're changing that, and we really appreciate that.
I'll look for your application.
All right.
Please take him.
Jealousy is an ugly thing, Norman.
Thank you all.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you, Leah. I love you, man.
I love you too. Take it easy. Take that Trump side down.
It was great, everybody.
Thank you so much, Lori. It was so great to have you here for it. That's not a cat behind you, is it?
Of course it is.
All you need is a broom.
I feel the
Thank
same
you.
way about you.
That's how we do it, obviously, here.
It's great seeing you, Lori. It's been a while.
Yes. So it sounds like you're doing great things.